people were partying, cars were honking, strangers greeted each other, gave out high fives.
The first thing you will see among far-right allies of Orban in Europe is a distancing from Trump and Vance and the MAGA movement. That clearly isn't going to work for them. And Europe needs to have more confidence in its capacity and its ability to stand up to the US administration and do things that it believes are fundamentally in the European interest.
And I really hope that, this time the new government build back democracy rather than, entrenching their own powers.
Welcome to the Fourcast. I'm Frei in Budapest today. I'm here because of the historic elections that delivered a crushing result, not just for Viktor Orbán last night, but also for nationalist populism in Europe and around the world, you might say. Take note, Giorgia Meloni, Marine Le Pen and Donald Trump. So Viktor Orbán was defeated and the opposition led by Péter Magyar won a 2/3 majority in Parliament. This is crucial because it actually allows Magyar to govern. Remember, it was the 2/3 majority that Orban got in 2010 that allowed him to change so many institutions, the rule of law, the judiciary, etc., everything that went into his concept of a liberal democracy. Well, it turns out that even in a liberal democracy has elections and they can be lost by the incumbent. And I have to say, Orban did bow out early and gracefully last night. So how important was this? Why did it happen? What are the lessons for Europe and the rest of the world? I'm joined by Mujtaba Rahman, who is a political analyst, and by Szilárd Teczár, who's a Hungarian journalist and disinformation expert. Welcome, gentlemen, to you both. Szilárd, let me start with you. I got very little sleep last night. The vibe on the streets of Budapest was kind of World Cup victory meets regime change. How was it for you?
Yeah, it was festive. It reminded me of 2016 when the Hungarian football team did quite well in the European Championship. So similar scenes played out on the streets of Budapest. I actually walked home from the office and people were partying, cars were honking, strangers greeted each other, gave out high fives. So really it was a jubilant mood, very much different from the previous elections where, even though Budapest always voted kind of majority for the opposition, but the national results were so bad for the previous opposition parties that it was very despondent vibes in Budapest. But this time it was totally different and kind of now the rest of the country, at least to some extent, went with the capital city.
And why do you think the opposition, led by Péter Magyar, who of course was a Fidesz insider, I mean, he was a regime guy until he wasn't, why do you think they managed to do it this time?
First of all, now they were the only credible alternative, the only real opposition party with chances of success, I would say. And precisely the fact that he is a former Fidesz insider and has nothing to do with all the opposition, so to say, which very much discredited itself, I think helped him tremendously. But of course, it's not one factor that can explain this. So the economic situation changed, also his personal style, and I would say a very good campaign helped. And Fidesz's campaign and Fidesz's communication didn't work as well as before, and also the disinformation campaigns, which they pretty much used this time as well, had presumably less effect than in 22. Also because it pretty much centered around the war in Ukraine. And now I think the salience of the issue in people's mind were much less than it was in 2022 or even in 2024 before the European parliamentary elections.
I mean, Midge, one of the things that really struck me was that Orban kept going on and on in his election rallies, in his messages on TV, in his posters about the link between Zelensky and Péter Magyar. And, he did the same thing 4 years ago, and it worked then because The Ukraine war had just started. People were terrified of it. It didn't seem to work this time. And it seemed like a really odd choice for a campaign message. What do you think, Midge?
I think it showed us that Fidesz is totally out of ideas. They flogged the Ukraine horse as much as they could, but as you say, it didn't really give them any meaningful return. I think people saw through the lies. I think Magyar was very effective as a credible conservative candidate, as you said in the beginning, a former Fidesz insider, at exposing the rot within the governance and the administration, and was very effective at holding Orban to account for the sluggish economy, the poor growth outlook, the fact people's living standards have been reversing compared to regional peers. And so in that context where the population is concerned about corruption, they're concerned about living standards, the Ukraine issue, I think, felt incredibly abstract and obviously simply didn't work for them.
I mean, I wonder if you're Giorgia Meloni, who has quite a pragmatic understanding of the limits of her populist appeal, or if you're Marine Le Pen, who's trying, or Jordan Bardella, who are trying to get into power in the French presidential election, or indeed the AfD in Germany. What are the lessons that you can learn from Viktor Orban's demise?
I think most important, Matt, I think will be lack of political space for MAGA in particular to interfere in European election cycles going forward. You'll remember when the national security strategy from the US State Department was published last year, member states in Europe, in Brussels, officials were quivering in their boots at the fear and the concern of explicit US government electoral interference in domestic politics in the member states. And I think what we've seen in Hungary, and we saw in Greenland as well, these things just haven't worked. And so I think the first thing you will see among far-right allies of Orban in Europe is a distancing from Trump and Vance and the MAGA movement. That clearly isn't going to work for them domestically. And then I suspect what we will begin to see on the Ukraine question as well is perhaps a bit more constructive opposition, a recognition, as I say, that flogging that Ukraine horse may not deliver a return when voters are more concerned about issues around cost of living and to some extent migration.
Szilárd, I mean, the AfD and indeed Nigel Farage in the UK have already been putting some distance between themselves and Donald Trump ever since the beginning of his war of choice in Iran. And they've kind of realized that actually with rising petrol prices and a general sense of chaos in the Middle East, that, you know, there's a real problem there. But at the same time as they were realizing that, we had JD Vance appearing in Budapest for 2 days on the campaign trail last week, you know, when he should have been dealing with the Middle East, you might argue. Campaigning on behalf of Orban, he appeared on the stage next to him. Donald Trump even rang into the rally at one stage, and on a crackly line you could hear Donald Trump saying, "I support Viktor 100%, etc., etc." Was that the kiss of death for Orban?
I mean, I wouldn't say that was the decisive issue, but definitely he didn't try to distance himself at all from Trump, quite the opposite. And on top of that, like what many analysts say right now is the style of his campaign, and his personal style also changed to a kind of MAGA thing. So, for example, he appeared in many interviews with like trash celebs, reality stars, which didn't really fit well with his, statesman image. He tried to imitate Trump to some extent. This strategy is credited to Balázs Orban, his campaign manager, but looks like it didn't work at all. And on the specific question of Iran, there was an interesting moment in this campaign. Basically the whole Fidesz message was that opposition would drag us into the Ukraine war, and Hungarian soldiers would be sent to Ukraine. And then one journalist asked a minister, what if Trump asked the Hungarian government to send troops to Iran? And he replied, we would think about it then. So he didn't say clearly that it's out of the question, and it really contradicted the whole campaign message of Fidesz.
Midge, I mean, is there a general lesson to be learned here that those people in European politics who don't like the Christian nationalist populist right have often in recent years felt almost as if they were trapped. That this was an inevitable momentum, that they would sweep the board, that liberal Europe was finished and was going to be squashed by illiberal Europe.
There is nothing inevitable about this insurgency of the far right, and I do think, again, talking in particular about the role of the US administration as we think about very important elections in Europe next year. Poland, Italy, France, the big one, presidential election, Jordan Bardella with 33% of the popular vote in absolute pole position compared to the political centre. It's in that context, I think, centrist parties need to have more confidence, and Europe needs to have more confidence in its capacity and its ability to stand up to the US administration and do things that it believes are fundamentally in the European interest. And I think what Péter Magyar has done, combating both populist nationalist forces globally, JD Vance, Trump, Putin, Fico, Marine Le Pen and her Rassemblement National allies, in the context of a heavily gerrymandered and electoral system that favoured Fidesz to deliver a two-thirds majority, should absolutely give confidence to centrist parties all over Europe that they have the wherewithal to confront these forces and do so effectively.
Péter Magyar, he is anti-immigration. Ideologically, he is definitely on the right, and I wouldn't even say on the centre-right. He's on the right. He's certainly not on the left. I mean, if you want to win an election these days, do you have to be strong and tough on immigration, wherever your kind of economic policies may lie, Midge?
You do, Matt, but I think we need to contextualise Magyar properly. And by that I mean, what I think we will see from him in Europe now is a position that is taken by many member states across the whole gambit of issues. You're right, he's not a fan of Ukraine accession, and he will fight Hungary's corner, but that is not dissimilar to the position of Macron or Tusk or any other mainstream member state. So I think what you have in Magyar is a centrist, right-leaning, but mainstream politician that will much more easily fit into that broader European consensus, where, as you say correctly, and I agree, immigration and cost of living are very prominent issues. But he's not on the political extreme, and he certainly will not be a vector for Russian and Chinese influence within the Union, which was the explicit position and goal and strategy of the Orban government. That's not what we're going to see with him. And so I do think at the European level, this is a game changer. It's a fundamental reorientation of politics in Hungary that will allow, I think, and enable Europe to be a much more effective geopolitical player, certainly when it comes to supporting Ukraine.
Szilárd, I mean, it struck me as really weird that Orban should be going on and on about Ukraine, as I've said before. He didn't mention Vladimir Putin by name, but it's obvious that this administration here, the outgoing one, was very friendly to Moscow and was seen by many, I think rightly, as Moscow's spanner in the EU works. Orban famously changed his mind for a Ukraine aid package of 90 billion euros at the beginning of the year. He managed to block that, and I'm assuming that will now be unblocked. But why do you think someone who seemed to have a sort of finger on the patriotic pulse very effectively for years, I'm talking about Orban here, was so friendly with Russia when the trauma of the 1956 uprising and how the Soviets crushed it is so prevalent in people's minds that one of the most prevalent slogans last night was F off Russia and Russia go home. I don't get it.
Yeah, I think it's the $1 million question why he started this Russian-friendly politics like back around 2014 with the nuclear plant built by Russian companies. But I think after a while he realized, or at least he believed, that this fits well into his overall politics and overall ideology, anti-EU, anti-LGBTQ, the demise of the West. And it did work in 2022 in the aftermath of the full-scale invasion. So I think in a way they became the victims of their own previous success, because they believed too much in the Russia-Ukraine war, angle of campaign, and continued this time, even though the situation now is completely different, and it's not on people's mind so much. Also, people could see that, okay, 4 years have passed. Many European countries supported Ukraine, and nobody was dragged into the war. So maybe it's not so believable anymore.
I mean, when you look at this extraordinary alliance of, Donald Trump, Viktor Orbán, Benjamin Netanyahu, who, by the way, he's visited Hungary even when he hasn't been allowed to or couldn't visit other European countries, and of course, Vladimir Putin, what combines them seems to be this infatuation, especially with Putin, that he is anti-woke, anti-LGBTQ plus rights, anti-political correctness. Do you think we sometimes underestimate the power of this political force, Mitch, in global politics that seems to override, national security, economic interest, the culture wars, or this aspect of them is immensely powerful, or certainly was until yesterday?
Yes, but Matt, beyond the culture wars, Orban, as you know, was a model and a template for illiberal democracy, constraining the judiciary, controlling the media, establishing a kleptocratic regime. As you know, Europe has not dispersed over billions and billions of euros, Matt, to the Hungarians because of concerns about that money not being used for the purposes for which it was designed. And so I think beyond the culture wars and LGBTQ and being tough on immigration, there's an entire system here that Orban created that I think, he was the spiritual godfather. And that, I think, was something that many leaders all over the world were looking to emulate. And so the question now, I think, is how sustainable is that model of governance going forward? Can centrist forces find their mojo and come back with a bit more fervour and a bit more momentum in light of the result that we saw overnight? That's absolutely, I think, the question when it comes to the French presidential election, but it's a question being asked in Brussels and all capitals across Europe this morning.
The other thing about Orban that he was so kind of good at and gallingly good at was railing against the European Union. And one of the other election slogans was the evil axis of Brussels and Kyiv. There were pictures of Ursula von der Leyen looking like a drugs pusher everywhere. I mean, she looked really, really rather bad in these posters. At the same time, he was very good at using EU funds to feather his countries and his own nest while hollowing out the institution. I mean, an extraordinary thing to do, really. Has that now run its course?
I think so, because I think, Matt, the data doesn't lie, right? If you look at GDP, any key economic metric, GDP per capita, economic growth outlook, Hungary's performance during the pandemic, the inflation outlook, on any key metric, it is clear that Hungary is a massive, massive underperformer compared to regional peers. And so I think, in particular, the youth, that was incredibly mobile. But even what was interesting about the result yesterday was in the constituency vote, where there wasn't good constituency level data, these Fidesz strongholds in the countryside massively turned towards Tisza and Péter Magyar. That is what delivered the 2/3 majority. And even the pollsters didn't capture that trend because there wasn't good data available. And so I think the general sentiment was across the country was people want to reimagine their future. They realize Hungary is underperforming. There is all of the sleaze that Magyar was very good at putting on social media and exposing the corruption, and he had the credibility to do it because, as you say, he came from within the system. And I think that was incredibly damaging for Orban. And we will see, Matt, now in Europe, in the institutions. I've been in Brussels a few weeks ago talking to officials in the European Commission. A lot of money is going to flow to Hungary very, very quickly. 6.5 billion in grants. That's money the Hungarians will not need to repay. That was in this this facility that was created in the aftermath of the pandemic to help countries recover from COVID. None of that money has been dispersed to Hungary. It's just sitting there. That facility expires at the end of the year. All of that money, I suspect, is going to flow into the real economy. This is going to boost growth. It's going to help living standards. It's going to further consolidate Péter Magyar and Tisza's power. And I think that's all a very, very good thing.
Szilárd, what do you think will happen now to Hungary's blocking of the 90 billion euros sent to Ukraine? I'm assuming that that will go. And also, what do you think that Péter Magyar will do with his 2/3 majority in parliament? What are the kind of changes that we can expect him to undergo?
Yes, so I think his Ukraine policy, to be honest, is quite vague. So actually, his strategy in the campaign was to say as little as possible on the issues in which Fidesz was seen as winning, like on LGBTQ, also Ukraine. One thing we know is that the EU accession of Ukraine, he promised to put that on a referendum. And like probably deliveries of weapon is kind of out the question, but like blocking the loan, I don't think he made a clear stance. And what would happen with the whole system? So at his victory speech, he immediately called for the resignation of the president, of the president of the Supreme Court, and like some other leaders of state institutions who were appointed by supermajority. I mean, what will happen is, of course, an open question. But since TISA will have a supermajority in one way or another, I think they will have an opportunity to oust these people.
I don't think there's any question at all about Magyar now supporting this 90 billion loan for Ukraine. Ukraine desperately needs that money. Otherwise, the administration will not have the money to either pay the military or civil servants and pensioners and do the things government needs to do. Remember, Hungary is not a financial contributor to that 90 billion loan. Orban secured an opt-out. Magyar will retain the opt-out. But what Europe does need is Hungary's approval on one piece of legislation that is unanimity. And Magyar, I think, will do that. There's no reason for him not to do it. And he'll want to do it because Europe, as I said, is sitting on billions of euros worth of financing that he absolutely needs to bolster his economy. And so I think that will move really quickly.
Szilárd, when the Law and Justice Party was defeated in Poland by Donald Tusk and the Progressives, again, a massive sense of relief, especially for, young urbanites and educated Poles, but a massive fight back from the remnants of law and justice in the judiciary, in the media, in the institutions of the state, where they had embedded themselves quite effectively. Can we expect the same thing to happen in Hungary?
Yeah, at least yesterday, Orban seemed to be quite determined to act as a strong opposition force. But on the other hand, I think the defeat is so huge that I wouldn't be surprised if some kind of movement would start within Fidesz. So I think we should look out for it, and there are some politicians, especially a minister called János Lázár, who is widely seen as one who could try to stage a rebellion against Orban. But I think that's one open question: what will happen inside Fidesz, and how all these people appointed by Fidesz to the heads of different state institutions will behave in the near future. So would they resign? Would they try to fight, or would they try to cooperate with the new government? I think all of these scenarios are possible, and these will be at the end of the day like not just the choice of Orban, but also personal choices of his close confidants.
And considering the fact, Szilárd, that there were so many accusations of corruption against Orban, is it possible that he himself might be investigated or even face trial?
I think it is possible. Magyar also promised to set up a new investigative body for corruption cases and to retrieve, the lost assets of the state. So we don't really know the details, but definitely the electorate has an expectation of him doing it. I mean, it's a bit similar to what Orban promised actually in 2010 that he would do with the previous socialist government, and in the end, it did not come to very much. Whether this time it will be different, I don't know. I think it's an open question. And also, what will happen with all these state-funded, but I mean, at least on paper, private companies, which we can see already on the stock market, how there is a big fall in their evaluation. So yeah, the Hungarian economy is set for a quite turbulent time, and not only because of the possible criminal investigations, but simply because the state was so involved in the economy that it won't be too simple to undo this, because there are also like banks involved, not only like construction companies.
Péter Magyar, I mean, he's much better looking in real life than he is on the posters. He's, I think, 45 years old. He did that walking tour across Hungary. You know, he comes across as a sort of svelte, whippet-like marathon runner personality. And he's clearly a very smart campaigner. But he's not very popular, is he? Had a rather troubled marriage. And people aren't very nice about him as a person. Can you tell us a bit more?
He is definitely popular now, although it's true that many people who voted for them are not really, like him personally, or they are not even center-right. There is an electorate, I think, for the left and for the liberals, but simply there was no other choice. So it's an open question how successful will he be in uniting or keeping together?
He's not an angel, and maybe, he'll discover the limits of that.
Yeah, like not an angel. And maybe one aspect which is personally important for me is how he behaves with journalists and toward the independent media is also not very encouraging. So many times when the independent press wrote something negative about him or Tisa, he called out the journalist as propagandists paid by Fidesz and so on and so forth. So yeah, I wouldn't bet on him behaving like an angel towards the media in government, but like things, at least in the media sector, cannot really get any worse, only better, at least in the short run, in my opinion.
I think you're right there. And no one likes journalists, let's face it. Midge, final one to you. I mean, is the real lesson here of this election a rather mundane one, which is whether you're populist right or you're populist left, at the end of the day, the biggest curse to any government, especially the elected ones, is incumbency.
Absolutely. Even in a heavily gerrymandered system that's been completely tilted to benefit the incumbent, after a while, if you're not addressing issues around standards of living, people aren't being made to feel better, they're worried about their future, then you're going to face a major pushback at the ballot box. I do think we should just take a second and recognise, though, what Magyar battled with, both internally, the system that he confronted, which Orban effectively kept rigging over the 16 years he was in power, combined with, as you said, Matt, global nationalist populist forces from Vladimir Putin to Donald Trump, to effectively manage those internal and external constraints and not only win, but deliver a 2/3 majority, I think is an absolutely remarkable outcome. And I should say, Matt, I imagine, and we'll see with Magyar, whether he now opens up and some of the concerns about how he engages with the media, etc., are resolved. But one perhaps signpost that gives me a bit of confidence is the team that he has selected. In particular, his choice of foreign minister, Anita Orban, his choice of economy and finance minister. These are really smart, competent people. They don't have executive or political experience, but on substance, these are the right people. And so let's see whether they now can actually transition from campaigning to governing and delivering, which, as you and I know, Matt, in the UK context, for example, has not been straightforward. But that's where the test, I think, now lies.
And do you think that Magyar could become the poster boy for the kind of anti-populist fight back in the way that Orban was the poster boy for the populist revolution in Europe?
I think people are going to be absolutely studying the election, what Magyar did, how the campaign worked, the strategies involved very, very, very closely. There are 3 major elections, Matt, in Europe next year. The big one being France, right? If France turns far right, the conversation we're having today we're having in reverse on steroids, because a France far right is a very different proposition than a Hungary far right. It would mean the end of the EU as we know it. And so I think there will be a lot of people engaging with the Magyar team to understand what happened and what they did and how they did what they did as they look to those elections next year. But the hope absolutely will be that they can turn the tide now and that momentum will move in the other direction.
Szilárd, Orban always claimed that he made Hungary great, but he also made Orban greater. What will Magyar do?
With himself, at least one promise which gives me confidence is he said that he would introduce a two-term limit for the prime minister. So I think that's a good sign, and I agree with Mitch that the choice of people around him it also looks quite good. So Anita Orban, István Kapitány, and so on. These are competent people. And I really hope that this time he or the new government will use this 2/3 opportunity wisely and build back democracy rather than entrenching their own powers.
And everyone will be watching. Easy and ever, ears are still ringing from last night's euphoria, which was, as we said at the beginning, quite extraordinary. A night to remember, I think, is the best way of summing it up. Szilárd Teczár, Mujtaba Rahman, thank you very much to both of you for coming on the Fourcast. That's it for this special edition from Budapest. I hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.